I'm very tempted to go back and work on one of these little glass puzzles. I enjoy doing it. Some of you who are teachers who teach physics probably would enjoy it. It takes probably an hour or two to do Boyle's law properly. And you start with the glass in the sink. And you can push the glass down into the sink. And the sink isn't big enough, so you have to move to the bath. And then eventually you rent a boat and you go out into the Bedford Basin, and the kids have to wear wetsuits. And you have the boat at the top of the water, and it's quite an adventure. And eventually you end up with a series of numbers, which you'll find in the book. You have a set of numbers and another set of numbers. You're measuring the water in the glass. You're measuring the depth under the water. And they have no connection. And we're back at any of the puzzles we've had already. You haven't got the connection. And it's not a hypothesis formulated after the collection. It's something that may stick you for weeks. And you have to repeat that with the students. Now, some people say, well, you couldn't possibly cover the course. Yes, if it's done properly, you'll do the same course. However, I won't get into that. Okay. The problem we left off with, which comes right into this question of Plato's cave, is the problem of the mental bypass, which is a huge problem in contemporary Western scholarship. And again, characterized by the definition of science I had here. You can collect and correlate an enormous amount of stuff, and you can become extremely eloquent about it. But what is lacking is an integrating insight. Now, the instance we're going to take out of Plato's cave is a simple instance that you all know from school days, and that is the science that is required to get from a cartwheel to the definition of a circle. How many of you know the definition of a circle? Yeah? Vague memory, yes? Oh, come on. Huh? It's gone, eh? How many of you learned it in school at some stage? Yeah? No? Wow. Okay. The definition you get in the books, not in Webster's dictionary, I think, is that a circle is the locus of etc., etc., etc. And again, the way it can be taught, I think this is the way I was taught in part of my school days until I met a decent teacher in mathematics. The way it was taught was that you might have been interested in why the cartwheel was round. But the teacher gave you the definition, which is a lot of words, okay. Let's call it a long name. And you never got the definition of the circle. Now, does this make some sense after our puzzles, etc.? Yeah? That you can learn a definition and you haven't got a definition. Yeah? And the sign is that you forget it. Whereas if you get the insight and the concept or the hypothesis, you don't forget it. You'll always be able to make up words. Now, what drove Plato to his theory of ideas was, would you believe it, ideas. And the difficulty with a lot of scholarship around Plato is that the scholars perhaps do not know geometry, which was one of the prerequisites that Plato thought should be there for doing philosophy. Why is the cartwheel round? If you mess long enough, talk about the spokes, are they the same length? Well, okay, but that has the same Yeah, they're all the same length, so you need more spokes and so on. Maybe after an hour, yeah, click, click. You get the idea. Okay, now an idea, I'm using a very technical word here, but it's useful to get a precise meaning for the word idea, is the content of an insight. And if you have the idea, you can spell out the concept. This is going to be important when we get further into the question of Christian faith. The content of the insight is the idea. I have an idea. And again, normal usage can help you here. I think I've got an idea. Well, tell us. Well, I can't tell you yet. Yeah, it's an idea. I haven't spelled it out yet. Now, the spelling out may not occur, especially if you're an artist. What the artist does is get an idea that goes into the concrete. The artist is not trying to formulate. Okay, Plato discovered ideas by having them. Fair enough? The problem we've had right through this course is having specimens of insight. That's why we take these little funny little illustrations, and that's why I tell jokes. So that you do have this experience. Now, Plato discovered that when he got the idea of a circle, it didn't look like a cartwheel, okay? That takes a lot of struggling with. The idea of a circle, the idea that is expressed, say, in later geometry by Descartes as x squared plus y squared is equal to a squared. Well, certainly that doesn't look like a cartwheel, does it? Okay. And that presents an idea of the radius. Well, I'm not going to try and spell this out. X squared plus y squared is equal to a squared. And you get that running round a. These vary, but a is always the same. But the idea is not visible. How does that strike you, that the definition of a circle isn't visible? Weird, isn't it? Yeah? The definition of inflation isn't visible. The definition of U isn't visible. I can draw diagrams with 13 elements, but the 13 elements aren't visible. And this is Plato's discovery. And let's push this now. The story of the cave is really bringing out the difficulty of inviting people into the invisible. Okay, let's sketch down the cave. Draw a little cave. Okay, we have a wall here. And there you are. You and your friends chained to the wall. You can think of a cinema maybe. And behind the wall you have this fire. And you've somebody here, not as tall as the wall. Holding up a cartwheel. Okay. And the light of the fire throws the shadow of the cartwheel on the end wall. Let's straighten it up a bit. Yeah? Okay. And you've been chained to the wall all your life. That's it. Yeah? We're interested in these shadows. Yeah? It's the given data. Okay. And again, back to the definition I got from Webster's dictionary. You can spend your life correlating the shadows, naming the shadows, and that's it. And in the little story, the point is that, well, yeah, the work, suppose one of them escaped and saw what really was going on, and eventually out beyond the fire and discovering the sun, but that's not important to us. It's okay, suppose somebody discovers. What's Plato getting at? He's getting at his discovery of geometry, that somehow the idea is much more real than the scene. Yeah? It's exciting. You start getting ideas. Yeah? Perhaps one of the conspiracies of our education is to stop these people getting ideas. We need stable government. Huh? Okay. So the problem he's bringing out is, yeah, liberating these people. If one is liberated, what can he say to these people? They wouldn't believe him. And again, you have the illustration of Socrates, the gadfly, revealing to people that they didn't have any ideas. Please tell me what you think of love, and then gradually exposing their talk. You find that, I think, in the book Wealth on page 17. There's a quotation from the book Insight, page 542 by Bernard Lonergan. And it talks about Socrates' discovery and the fact that people can be tremendously eloquent in talking about the shadows, or back to our scientific business, in talking about the data. And Plato discovered that the shift up from puzzling to the idea brings you into another world, a world of ideas. And my suggestion is, as I close the first half, my suggestion was that there seems to be in the West a tradition of literacy and education which makes us merely talking animals, well informed. Worth thinking about. Okay, so the parable of the cave then is a parable about the levels of me. I'm not claiming Plato had worked out these elements. You'll find, yes, there's evidence there. The forms he's talking about are forms, are ideas. And you'll find Aristotle, I think I mentioned before, that you can characterize these three great Greeks. Their ages are like grandfather, father, and son. You've Socrates and Plato, and Aristotle is the third, but Socrates' emphasis on the question, Plato's emphasis on the idea and the concept, and Aristotle putting in the twist, if you like. How do you get ideas? By searching in experience. Okay. The myth of the cave, we could do an entire course on that. This is a very skimpy introduction, suggesting that the clue to Plato's cave lies in discovering personally the first four elements of meaning. Indeed, the clue to Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates is finding out where does one go when one leaps out of the sensible into the world of forms. Okay, and where does one go? We're back to the question of props. Now, I've got 4 squared plus 1 here. let's perhaps spell out the 4 squared plus 1. Props, propositions, but also props. Props in a cave, you know, poles that hold it up. Prevent you from being crushed, whatever. The one. We are, if you like, in our living in Plato's cave. And the prop, I could also put in the word rock, foundation, basis. The prop we were talking about before the midterm was the prop of faith, which is something, some type of conviction of friendliness. The universe isn't entirely hostile. Now you'll find that that is one of the last exercises in 2.5. And we're going to talk about that under the next number 3. What do I mean by 4 squared? You will remember our 4 props. Yes, no. Which we've been revising in the first half of tonight. What is knowledge? It's correctly understanding experience. And there's a type of knowledge, and this will help some people who were messing with this problem in their exam. Some people who felt, well, really we know nothing. No, you know a lot of things. You can name a lot of things. There is a knowledge, correctly understanding experience, where the understanding isn't much more than naming. Okay? Elementary botany, you learn how to name and recognize plants, dandelions, daisies, etc. So you have a common sense knowledge that is basically nominal. And you have a knowledge that involves serious understanding. Okay. And that is science or scientific in my sense of science. Not a collection of data, but a serious understanding. And regularly that is emotional. It's exciting. Now this is going to be important when we push into the question of faith-seeking understanding. Okay, that was our first proposition. And we had 3 others. Knowledge gets you at reality. And I'm not sure whether I should pause over that for a while. Let me go on and come back to it, because it puzzles a certain number of people who are trying to think through this course and figure out whether reality is inside each of us. Well, it's not. Okay, knowledge gets you at reality. You'll recall that the box inside the skin. Sense, the what, it is. Knowledge is when you get to yes saying, and that gets you at reality. The sense, sensitive integration, I called it the percept, and it's inside us. Fair enough. We had a little fun with glasses and so on. And the percept is not like reality. And this, again, we're back in Plato's cave. The scene, the shadow on the wall, is not like the idea of a circle. An idea isn't like something visible. Now that's a horribly difficult thing to work out. We're back to the question of Augustine spending 10 years, and so on. Don't panic about that. Now, okay, knowledge gets you at reality. Is then reality in your head? No, no, there's a real world in which we live. It's not the projection of sensibility, but it's reached because you have a natural orientation to do something called know, and it naturally gives you reality within yourself that corresponds to the real, let's say the real cow. Okay, there's a real cow in a field, and there's a known cow in your head. And naturally, by nature, by human nature, this known cow, if you do this properly, corresponds to the real cow. But you can't go outside your skin to check it. Now, I had some very good struggles with that in the exams, and I'm not saying this clears it up. I mentioned in Wealth of Self that I certainly struggled with this for about 7 years before I began to figure out what was going on. Don't despair. Now, so that's a set of props that can help one think out the problem of Plato's cave. What's Plato talking about? He's talking about knowledge. What's his key discovery? His key discovery is that understanding is something very real and very different from seeing. And that there's a world of forms, a world of ideas. And he struggled with that all his life. Okay, now, you've got these four propositions to help you read this little story. What's he talking about? He's talking about human knowledge and how you move to the second level of ideas, and how ideas are very remote from the shadows. Okay, now, this set of props helps you to think out who you are. Okay? And thinking that out is philosophy. This prop here doesn't require philosophy. It doesn't require argument. We talked about that the last day. At least I talked about it, and some people talked to me after the class about it. You have a conviction. It's a rock. Now, I mentioned, say, the problem of somebody asks you, why are you a Muslim or a Christian? I am. Well, don't you have to argue it out and say what proves it to you? No, it's a conviction I've got. It's my prop, it's my rock. Rock there is connected with, say, Peter, Petrus in Latin, in the Roman tradition, but I don't want to tie this to Peter the Apostle. But the point I'm making here is that this is a spontaneous prop that can carry people through life. You're in Plato's cave, you don't understand what's going on in life, but there's a conviction expressed, say, in the Christian tradition, I know my Redeemer liveth. Okay, so this is the philosophic, this is religious conviction, and remember, I kept it very general. It's not necessarily a divinity. We'll spell that out a little later under the next point, a little more. Now, 4 squared, there are 4 other props. What are these 4 other props? Okay, they're the spontaneous. Me, I. Okay. And here I'm inviting you to do a little exercise preliminary to exercise 2.5.24. And it's an exercise that should have occurred to you from reading page 100 of Process. And I can just imagine some of you turning back the page and saying, golly, yes, why didn't I notice that? The spontaneous I is described, therefore we're beyond spontaneity, as ethical. On Wealth, page 52, the last lines. And process 100, the spontaneous I is described as someone who can be attentive, intelligent, be intelligent, who can be reasonable, and who can be responsible. All right. Okay, what's our puzzle? And I'm very much inclined to leave this puzzle with you. I'm not sure. Where does the puzzle come from? If you look at page 100, or you look at Wealth 15 and Wealth 48, you'll find that you get five levels. Yes? Some of you wrote remarkable questions on the 5 levels and the 5 whys and so on. And yet when you look at this page, you'll find 4. Now, isn't that strange? Do you remember the 5 levels? Have you forgotten them since the midterm? Oh, no. Now, the spontaneous I is you before you do philosophy. Okay, the 13 elements are not some new invention. They're just what you were doing all along. Isn't that fair enough? Yeah? Badly, but still you were doing it. Okay. You were asking what is, what to do. All right. So my point is the spontaneous I is a rock. It's a basis. It's a prop. It's a measuring rod. It's where you test empirically. It's something there without any examination. Why are we examining it? Because there are a lot of people telling us that that's not the way we are. And Webster's dictionary was one of the instances of that. It's important to discover the spontaneous self because there's a lot of people out there telling you that you're not that way. Huh? The spontaneous self is wonderful. Well, you're lucky if your boyfriend tells you you're wonderful after a few drinks. Okay, now we worked hard in the first 5-6 weeks to discover these 5 levels of sense. What? What's the situation? And you get the idea and you want to check it out. Is that the way it is? And then the situation of planning. Well, what am I going to do? Okay, it's another what question. You remember Emma on the beach. What am I going to do? And am I going to do one of these? Now you remember the instance we had, we discussed making a dinner. What am I going to do? And you can think up, you can get wonderful ideas. And then you can follow up by spelling out, turning the bright idea into a very definite recipe. Okay. Or a set of recipes. And then, well, which am I going to do? Now, how do I get from these 5 to what is called in this chapter, page 52, the moral law? Isn't that a $64 question? Should I leave it with you? Would you like to have a puzzle for the week? Yeah, good. Okay. Now you see my puzzle here, that I do have 5 attitudes of us, and yet I end up here, if you like, putting those together as one attitude. I think it is a very good exercise. Those of you out there in television land, I would love you to write your answers. Yeah? What, 1% extra. Or those of you not doing the course, I'm interested in people reacting to these sort of puzzles. How do you get from there to there? And it's going to be very essential when we get to solving the basic puzzle of chapter 4. But my point here is that in Plato's cave, which is us trapped in the 20th century, say, where collecting data has become a fashion, and we have built up a tremendous technology of information, and there is a dearth of insight. We will spell that out more as we go along. It's important to have props. One of the props is some conviction, which we're going to talk about immediately, called faith, that somehow I am of worth, that there's a worth about my life. And that's the conviction of faith. Now, the second prop is the self that is spontaneous and that is uncomfortable when it is abused, whether it's in an office or an education system, that somehow there's a reach there, an aspiration, a desperation, and you don't need this course to discover that, the spontaneous self. And that's your fundamental prop. And this is not easy to discover. When we get a little further in the question of religion, beliefs, and institutions, you will find that the ethical is identified by things that are not the spontaneous self. What is it to be ethical? It's to be, let's stay with these 5 levels, to be attentive, to be intelligent, to ask what, try to understand, to reach for the truth, to be adventurous, not a very popular ethical norm in any religion, I know, yeah. Can you imagine a moral law that says, be adventurous? Yeah. How many of the 10 Commandments are negative? Thou shalt not. Okay, the spontaneous self, I'm inviting you to identify this spontaneous self as the ethical. That the ethical, the normative, is you. Now, this should stir up a lot of questions in your mind. What about the moral law? What about the precepts of the various churches, etc.? Okay. And I'm leaving that dangling, that somehow this is you, and you are called not by an extrinsic set of rules, but by your inner dynamism to be you. Okay, and that is the second set of 4. Now, why it's 4 instead of 5, you're going to solve that before next week, aren't you? Will you come up and do this all next week? Okay. All right, we're going to leave that as a problem, something to think out. And this question of the ethical will turn up when we develop the notion of faith and reasoning, which is number 3 on our list. And we're certainly not going to get to number 5 or 6. Okay, number 3 on our list was faith and reasoning. Okay. That's pretty well the title of our course. And we sort of got that far the last day. We're not really finished the course. Reason and religious belief. What is reasoning? We spent 4 lectures on that, and we spent the first half of tonight on that. What is reasoning? We started to talk about faith as a conviction of friendliness. Okay, and we talked about that conviction as occurring to somebody gently or startlingly, a kindly light. You may have grown up in a certain faith, and there's nothing startling about you being in a church or dancing with the Krishna group. Or Mommy and Daddy were in it, you're there too. It's a conviction, and that conviction is in you. Okay. It's not detached. It's you with a conviction. Convicted, okay. Okay, and it's a conviction within the spontaneous. And let's put in that. The spontaneous reacher. Now, there's a point here that it's worth making at this stage. On the list for our lectures, there's a session on art, religion and art. I talk about the spontaneous reacher. And, all right, very briefly, if you think of these diagrams I use with the 5 levels, the spontaneous reacher that is me, what I'm doing here is I'm bringing the question down. Some people raise the question of beauty and sense. The spontaneous reacher that is me is a reaching that is a reach in sensibility. My eyes are different from a rabbit. My possibilities of movement. So the spontaneous reacher is an embodied reacher. The dim light of our embodied loneliness is a description I gave a couple of weeks ago. Okay, the conviction is within that spontaneous reacher. Now, I'm trying to set this up so that you can allow for all sorts of strange convictions. I was thinking today, thinking out the sort of conviction that goes with being part of a mafia family. Could that be religious? Yeah? You're committed to the Godfather. I'm sure some of you have seen Godfather 1, 2, or 3. Are there more? The point about the conviction that somehow makes it genuine and a genuine possibility is that it is within the spontaneous reacher. And that spontaneous reacher very centrally is a whatter. Now we're back in the second session we had when I quoted the Bhagavad Gita, the question, what is it to be human? And I said, yes, that's it. Yeah, what? Okay. So the conviction is connected with a spontaneous whatting. And there is a sign of genuineness of the conviction, no matter how crazy it is, if that whatting is not thwarted, beaten down. Now, let me illustrate this a little bit by a problem that, say, Christians have. And the problem is, well, are you allowed to question faith? Oh, you're not supposed to question your faith, are you? Yeah. That's a terrible thing to do, questioning your faith. Oh, gosh, no, there are two types of question. Okay. The what question is not a question of doubt. It's wanting to know what's going on. Is that fair enough? How many of you know the phrase, are you questioning my authority? Yeah? Say you go to a friend and you say, well, really, I've been questioning our friendship. Huh? The ethos we live in connects that with doubt. Your friendship is dead if it's not being questioned. There's a spontaneous what? There's a spontaneous whatting within us. Maybe. It was there when we were 3. Now you've got a friend and it's just old, stale, yeah? We do the same thing every week, yeah? Okay, so the conviction I'm talking about here, and I haven't specified any religion, I've used Christianity as an example, is a conviction within a human subject that has a spontaneous ethics, normativity, and that normativity is a what in the universe. So you have, what's the first connection of faith and reason? You have faith seeking understanding. Okay? And I think that's a very important thing to meditate on, to think out. Have I a faith that seeks understanding? Or do I sort of know it all in some way? Have I some other rock, like the Bible, a collection of sayings, a collection of rules? Sometimes I meet born-again Christians, and the last thing I notice about them is that, or the first thing I notice is that this isn't there. They're beating me on the head with their view. Faith-seeking understanding is the spontaneous subject let loose on its own conviction. And not let loose in a doubting fashion, but in a fashion that wants to know, well, what's going on? This is terrific. I was up the hill and I saw the light. What is it? Without that spontaneous aliveness, there's the possibility of some sort of clique, a group that separates itself off from the rest of the universe. Okay, so that's a primary aspect of the aliveness of faith. This is going to be a rather troublesome thing to meditate on. Faith seeking understanding. Okay. I'm going to talk about the Christian tradition because that tradition generated this phrase, in fact. Let's write down the Latin version of it, because the Latin version has led to a bad translation. It comes from somebody prior to St. Augustine. I think it's Vincent of Lerone, or somebody like that. Anyway, it's an early Christian adage or statement. Fides quaerens intellectum. Faith seeking what answers? Now, the problem of this Latin tag is that it has been warped in the tradition to mean faith-seeking certainty. And that's where the notion of doubting your faith comes in. Faith-seeking certainty. I mentioned Cardinal Newman, or John Henry Newman, last day, and his hymn, Lead Kindly Light. And I mentioned his adage, 1,000 difficulties do not make a doubt. You're seeking understanding. There's no problem of certainty, it's just that the whole thing's obscure. Now, opposite, or at the other pole from Newman, you have a tradition around somebody like Descartes. And they give rise to two quite different psychologies of living. The Cartesian tradition, you're not clear on something, so you start doubting things, and you drop everything. Like Descartes, the famous story of him going off into the oven or whatever and sitting and eventually coming out with that rather foolish statement, I think, therefore I am. Doubt everything and then make a fresh start. It's quite daft. Newman's notion is that you hang on to everything and pull out the worst conviction you've got. It's a terrific recommendation. I want to change my life. Well, pick out something that obviously needs changing. I'm thinking also of traditions of Christian perfection. I recall Bernard Lonergan lecturing on the question of becoming perfect. And there are traditions of Christian asceticism that concentrate on the small things, that you perfect the way in which you walk or talk or whatever. Lonergan's notion was that being perfect means struggling to remove the largest obstacle in your life. It's a different attitude. Now, Newman's attitude towards difficulties is, well, okay, you find, or towards, say, imperfections, is you pick out something that's obviously wrong. But you don't spread your difficulties all around and live in doubt. So faith-seeking intellectum is not seeking certainty, but seeking understanding. What is happening to me? We talked about the person, say, on the hill, watching the sunset, watching the sea. There's a lift. It's good. We're doing good. All thing is well. Wow. And you want then to find out what? You're seeking understanding. Okay. Now, I'm talking about the spontaneous subject. And going back now from Christianity, the seeking of understanding of the spontaneous subject in history brings up the question of, well, is there a minimal understanding of this wow. And you do find, in fact, and I will give you the name, a German called Friedrich Heiler, who investigated more or less the primitive basic elements in all the high religions. Now, I mean by that the developed groups with convictions, the Christian group, Muslim, the Jewish group, the Zoroastrian group, the Taoist group, the Hindu group, and the Buddhist group.